Nobody told Hester Vane she was leaving until she was already half in her coat. Margot had a key. She had held it since Douglas died, for emergencies, and she had used it that morning without ringing ahead, stepping into the hallway with Pete behind her, while Hester was still working her arm into the second sleeve. Carrow Isle had been empty for 35 years. The tidal island off the Brackmore coast that Hester's mother Isabel had worked and lived on for 3 decades, its cottage standing, its curing shed standing, the causeway crossing twice a day at low tide, and nobody crossing it. Hester had £200 when she confirmed the island was still in her name. She crossed the causeway anyway. What was under the stone slab in the floor of that curing shed, in Isabel's handwriting, was not just a record, it was proof of a life that had been more than anyone had understood. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Hester Vane had spent the most important summers of her childhood on an island, not a romantic island, a working one. Carrow Isle was small enough to walk around in 20 minutes, a tidal island off the Brackmore coast, connected to the shore by a causeway of flat stones that the sea covered twice a day, and exposed twice a day with the indifference of something that has been doing the same thing since before anyone was there to observe it. The cottage on the island had 2 rooms. The curing shed had 1. The pier was stone and had been built by someone long dead who understood what a pier needed to do and had done it correctly. Isabel Vane had acquired the island when Hester was 4 years old, through circumstances that were never entirely explained to Hester or to anyone else, and had proceeded to make it her primary working premises for the next 30 years. She smoked fish and potted shellfish using methods she had developed across years of solitary experiment, cold smoking with combinations of driftwood and peat that she adjusted batch by batch according to what the wood was doing that day and what the weather was contributing to the smoke, and what the fish itself needed, which varied by species and by season and by how long it had been out of the water. She brined to ratios she kept in a notebook. She noted everything. Hester had spent her summers on the island from the age of 7 to the age of 17, working alongside Isabel during the school holidays, learning the technique in the way that children learn physical skills from parents, through imitation and correction and repetition, until the knowledge moves from the head to the hands and becomes something else. She had learned the smoking and the brining and the potting. She had learned which driftwood combinations produced which qualities of smoke. She had learned how to read the tide gauge Isabel kept on a hook by the cottage door, a small brass instrument graduated in inches with a ring at the top for hanging, used to judge the causeway crossing times, and which readings meant you had 2 hours, and which meant you had 20 minutes, and which meant you were staying the night. When she was 18, Hester had left the island and gone to the mainland to work, first in a cannery on the north coast, and then in a series of factory and processing jobs that moved her progressively south and inland, away from the water, until she was living in Brackmore again in her 30s, working in a supermarket distribution center, married to a quiet man named Douglas who had died 4 years ago, and making small quantities of smoked fish in her kitchen once or twice a year from what she could source, enough for herself and occasionally for a neighbor who knew to ask. The kitchen production was not what it should have been, and she knew it. The equipment was wrong and the quantities were too small to develop the smoke properly, and there was no island air and no island water and no island wood, which were not sentimental requirements but practical ones, because the specific character of what Isabel had made came from the intersection of those things with the technique, and the technique alone in a kitchen in Brackmore was not the same thing. She knew it was not the same thing. She made it anyway because making it incorrectly was better than not making it, and because the knowledge needed to be practiced or it would leave, and she was not willing to let it leave. The tide gauge had been on the hook by Isabel's cottage door for 30 years. After Isabel died, it had been on the hook by Hester's front door in Brackmore for 35 years. She took it with her when she left the house, and she brought it back when she returned, a habit so long established she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing anything that has been part of the structure of your days for long enough. Douglas had understood this without being told. He had repainted the hallway once and asked her where she wanted the hook moved to, and she had looked at the hook and then at the tide gauge hanging from it and had said, "It stays where it is." He had repainted around it. Isabel had died when Hester was 39. She had left the island to Hester in her will, which Hester's younger sister Margot had contested on grounds that were technically valid and emotionally characterized by the specific resentment of someone who has spent their life watching a parent pay more attention to the other child. Margot had always understood the island as the proof of this, the physical evidence of a preference, the place Hester had been taken to and she had not, and the will confirming that preference in property had been more than she was willing to accept without objection. The contest had settled in Hester's favor after 8 months of correspondence between solicitors that had cost more than Hester could afford, and left a particular kind of scar on the relationship between the sisters that had not healed so much as calcified. The island had been Hester's for 35 years, technically, on paper, administratively, in a way that had not translated into her ever going back, because the going back had felt too large to approach from the life she was living, and because approaching it would have required confronting the scar, and the scar was easier to leave alone. Margot was 59. She lived in Brackmore, 6 streets away from Hester, with her husband Pete, and she ran a small letting agency that managed holiday properties on the coast with the organized efficiency of someone who has found their vocation in the management of other people's assets. She had a gift for identifying what was underutilized and what could be done with it, and she had applied this gift her whole professional life to properties and her whole personal life to other people's situations, including Hester's, not from malice, but from a genuine conviction that her assessment of what was underutilized and what could be done about it was usually correct. The landlord was a man named Forsyth, who owned 3 properties on the same street and who had been intending to sell for years and had finally done it, and who had rung Margot first rather than Hester because Margot and Forsyth knew each other from the coastal property network, and Margot had seen an opportunity to solve 2 problems at once. The problem she was solving was not malicious. Margot genuinely believed she was helping. She had identified an assisted living complex on the Hill Road, very well reviewed, a warden on site 5 days a week, available from the 1st of next month. She had visited it. She had spoken to the manager. She had compiled a folder. Hester did not know about the folder until she saw it in Pete's hands in her hallway. Pete was Margot's husband of 25 years. He was a large, quiet man who had long ago reached a private accommodation with his wife's decision-making that involved appearing to be present in difficult conversations while maintaining a specific quality of interiority that protected him from their outcomes. He stood in Hester's hallway behind Margot, and he took his phone from his jacket pocket and looked at the screen and put it back. Then he listened to Margot explain. Then he took the phone out and looked at the screen again and put it back. He did this throughout, not checking anything, not responding to anything, simply taking the phone out and looking at it and putting it back, as if the phone gave him a location other than the hallway, and elsewhere he could briefly visit without actually leaving. Margot explained the situation with the thoroughness she brought to all practical matters. The notice from Forsyth, the timeline, the complex on the Hill Road and its considerable advantages, the practicality of the arrangement, the fact that Margot had done the research so that Hester would not need to. Hester finished putting her coat on while Margot spoke. She said, "I need to think about this." She took the tide gauge from the hook by the door. She went to the shops. She bought the things she needed, and she walked home by the longer route along the harbor road, and she thought about Carrow Isle the whole way, which was the first time she had let herself think about it directly in years, rather than approaching it sideways before thinking about something else. She did not go to the complex on the hill road. She went to the land registry. The island was still in her name. It had been in her name for 35 years, and the rates had been minimal, and she had paid them automatically from a standing order she had set up years ago and had not reviewed. The cottage was listed as a residential structure. The curing shed was listed as an agricultural outbuilding. Both were extant, meaning standing, meaning present. She rang the council's coastal property team and spoke to a man named Vincent, who was helpful in a specific way, who told her that the island was outside the council's maintenance responsibilities as a privately held asset, but was within the coastal access framework, which meant the causeway was maintained by the Coastal Paths Authority, which meant the crossing was legal and the stones were kept clear. He also told her that the island had no current rating for commercial food production, but that the agricultural classification of the curing shed would support an application for small-scale artisan production if she wished to pursue one, and that the application process was relatively straightforward for traditional methods that had historical precedent at the site. She had not thought about this yet. She thought about it on the walk back to the guest house. She had £200 left when she finished these calls. She rang Forsyth and told him she would vacate on the agreed date. Then she went to the harbor. Tam Colley was at the harbor at first light, as he was every morning, checking the mooring lines on the small boat he kept there out of habit rather than active use, a habit of 38 years that had outlasted his working life on the water and showed no signs of concluding. He was 68. He was lean and weather-worn in the specific way of men who have spent their adult lives at the intersection of wind and salt water. He knew the tides around Carrow Isle better than anyone living, which was information he held with the completeness of someone who has kept it current without being asked to. Hester asked him about the causeway crossing times. He told her without hesitation the complete information, the specific windows, the margin of error that depended on the weather and the wind direction and the phase of the moon, the way to read the exposed stones when you could not check a table, the single flat stone at the midpoint of the causeway that sat slightly proud of the others and served as a reliable depth marker. He delivered all of this as a coherent and precise account, the way you deliver information you have been organizing in your head for a long time. When he was finished, Hester said, "How long have you known those crossing times?" He said, "Since your mother." She looked at him. He said, "I used to stand off the island in the boat on the bad days in case she needed to come off in a hurry. She never did. But I kept the times." Hester was quiet for a moment. She said, "Thank you." He said, "The tide is going out now. You have until 2:30. She crossed that morning with 2 bags, the tide gauge in her coat pocket, Tam's information written in pen on the back of her left hand because she did not entirely trust herself to remember it, and the specific quality of attention that comes from approaching something you have been avoiding for 35 years. The causeway was exactly as she remembered and entirely different, the way places are when you have been absent long enough to have let your memory of them calcify into something fixed, and then the place turns out to be living and changed and the same. The flat stones were the same flat stones, worn smooth in the same places, the same slight rise at the midpoint that Tam had described as the depth marker. The water on either side was the same tidal water it had always been, green-gray, cold, the weed visible below the surface at low tide. The smell was the same, entirely the same, and this was the detail that made 35 years briefly permeable, because smell does not compress or alter with time the way visual memory does, and the smell of the Carrow Isle causeway was indistinguishable from the smell of every summer crossing she had made as a child and teenager. She stopped at the midpoint and stood still for a moment. The island was ahead of her. The shore was behind her, both equally accessible. She walked on. The cottage was cold and damp and in better condition than she had allowed herself to hope. The walls were sound. The roof was intact on the seaward side and missing 3 slates on the landward side, which was a problem but a finite one. The windows needed reseating. The floor was flagstone and dry. The hearth was intact and the flue was clear, which she confirmed by the light visible above when she looked up from the fireplace. She moved through each room with her hand on the walls, reading the stone. What was damp and what was merely cold? What had moved and what was settled? The back wall was the driest, sheltered from the prevailing weather by the curing shed attached to it. The front wall, facing the sea, had absorbed more than the others, but had held. The curing shed was better still. Its walls were thick stone, thicker than the cottage, built for a purpose that required control of temperature and ventilation, and they had done their job through 35 years of abandonment. The interior was cold and dry in the way that well-built stone buildings hold cold and dryness. The smell of decades of smoke so deep in the stone that it was indistinguishable from the stone itself. The way the smell of serious work done over a long time becomes part of the fabric of the place where it was done. The original smoking racks were still in place, heavy iron frames on chains from the ceiling, dark with the residue of 30 years of use. She put both hands on the nearest rack and pushed. It held. She pulled it. It held. She rocked it. It held. She stood in the curing shed in the cold and the specific smell of Isabel's work and did not speak. On the 3rd day she found Brigid. She heard her first from the cottage, a sound from the direction of the stone pier on the island's south side that was distinct from the sound of the sea, and she went out and around the east side of the cottage, and there was a woman on the pier, sitting on the low wall with a fishing rod over the water, absolutely settled, as if the pier were hers, which in 35 years of nobody coming to the island it might reasonably have felt like it was. Brigid Tully was 67. She had been widowed 2 years ago, her husband, Declan, gone after a sudden and complete cardiac event that had rearranged her life in ways she was still understanding. She had been fishing from Carrow Isle's pier for 20 years, crossing at low tide in her own small kayak that she kept beached at the harbor, because the fishing around the island was better than anywhere accessible from the shore, and because nobody had ever told her she could not. She was not apologetic about this. She looked at Hester with the assessment of someone who intends to establish the terms of a negotiation before the other party has finished arriving. She said, "Are you staying?" Hester said, "This is my island." Brigid said, "I know whose island it is. I asked if you were staying." Hester said yes. Brigid looked at her for a moment. She said, "Declan used to say whoever had this island and did nothing with it was wasting something worth having." Hester said, "He was right." Brigid reeled in her line and cast it again. She said, "I will keep fishing here if that is all right." Hester said, "I am going to need help with the pier wall on the east side." Brigid looked at the east wall of the pier without moving from her position. She said, "The second stone from the end is loose. Has been for 3 years. I have been meaning to sort it." They looked at each other. Then Brigid began to explain what the east wall needed, and Hester listened, and that was the beginning of it. The conflict came in the 4th week. Brigid had begun spending time on the island beyond her fishing, helping with the structural work on the cottage and the curing shed, and she had opinions about the order of operations that differed from Hester's. Brigid wanted to get the cottage habitable to a proper standard first, and the curing shed operational later. Her argument was that a habitable cottage was the foundation of everything else, and that working from a cold, uncomfortable base would slow down all the other work. Hester wanted the curing shed operational and the cottage secondary because the curing shed was the reason she was here, and the cottage was where she slept, and she could sleep in a cold cottage, but she could not smoke fish in a non-operational curing shed. They argued for 2 days. Both of them were right in different ways, and neither of them found the other's rightness persuasive, which made the argument honest if frustrating. It was resolved when Bridget came one morning and started working on the curing shed ventilation system without mentioning the previous 2 days, which was Bridget's way of concluding an argument that she had decided to end rather than win. Hester accepted this as the resolution it was and did not mention it either. After that, Bridget's presence on the island shifted from visitor to something that had no name but was more than visitor, and Bridget navigated this shift with the practicality of someone who has stopped asking permission for things she has already decided. Joel Ferris arrived in the 2nd week. He was 31. He had a doctorate in marine biology, specializing in intertidal ecology, that had been completed just before the research funding that was meant to continue his work had been withdrawn, a casualty of a decision made at a level several above his own, and he had spent the following year doing seasonal coastal work, mussel harvesting and seaweed collection, and a stint of beach survey work for a conservation organization. Good work that used some of his skills and none of his training, and that he was performing with the quiet competence of someone coasting on a capacity that was not being asked to extend itself. He had heard about Carrow Isle through the Coastal Work Network, a message on a group thread that mentioned someone working an island off Brackmore, and he had come on a Tuesday afternoon in his own kayak, landing at the pier with a question about whether there was any mussel survey data for the surrounding waters. Hester told him she did not have survey data, but she had 30 years of Isabel's production records, which described the shellfish populations around the island in considerable detail across 3 decades. He stayed for 3 hours looking at Isabel's records from the first notebook she had found in the cottage, the one Isabel had kept in the open rather than hidden, and he came back the next morning. His withdrawal was not the restaurant pulling at Kwame, but the academy pulling at Joel. A different kind of pull with a different weight attached to it. The offer came through a former colleague at the university where he had done his doctorate, a fixed-term research position studying intertidal habitat recovery at 3 sites on the West Coast, well-funded, well-regarded, exactly the kind of position he had been waiting for when the original funding had collapsed 2 years before. He told Hester about it at the end of a working day, sitting on the pier wall with the water below them. In the straightforward way he did most things. She said, "What do you want to do?" He said he did not know. He said the position was everything he had been trying to get back to. He said the work here was different, that it did not use his training in the same way, that he was not sure what he was doing on an island learning to smoke fish when he had spent 8 years becoming a marine biologist. Hester listened to all of this. Then she said, "What is Isabel's notebook?" He thought about it. He said, 30 years of intertidal observation. She said, "Done by someone with no training and no institution, just attention and time." He was quiet. She said, "I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you what is here." He sat with it for a week. He turned down the position. He told Hester the following morning and then asked what the shellfish population on the west side of the island looked like and whether she had ever counted the mussel beds. He had been reading Isabel's smoking notebook, the one from the tin under the stone slab, which by then had been open on the curing shed table for 2 weeks, and he had come to Hester with it in both hands and said, "Your mother was a scientist." Hester said, "She was a smoker of fish." Joel said, "She was recording micro-variations in smoke penetration by temperature and wood composition over 30 years. She was running a longitudinal study. She did not call it that, but that is what this is. He held the notebook up. The pages were visible, Isabel's careful entries, date and weather and wood combination and brine ratio and outcome, column after column, year after year. He said, "This is the most sustained piece of site-specific environmental and production observation I have ever seen from a non-institutional source." Hester looked at the notebook. She said, "She was paying attention to what she was doing." Joel said, "For 30 years, without stopping, without anyone asking her to." He turned down the research position. He told Hester the following morning and then asked what the shellfish population on the west side of the island looked like and whether she had ever counted the mussel beds. She had not. She had Isabel's counts from the 1970s. He got his notebook. If you have made it this far into Hester's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. Orla Mackay arrived in the 3rd week. She was 16, the daughter of the Brackmore harbour master, a position her father held with the same practical seriousness that Orla appeared to have inherited. She had watched Hester cross the causeway from the harbour wall one morning while she was supposed to be on her way to school, and she had followed at a distance, and she had stood at the landward end of the causeway for 20 minutes after Hester disappeared onto the island, and then she had crossed. She appeared at the cottage door with a direct question. She wanted to know how the smoking rack attachment worked, specifically whether the chain fittings were original or replacement, because she had a project about traditional food preservation methods for her geography class, and the island was the only example of a functioning traditional smoking facility within 40 miles. Hester looked at her for a moment. She said, "The fittings are original. Come in." Orla came in. She stayed for 4 hours. She asked more questions than Hester had been asked in years, and took notes in a spiral-bound notebook with the focused attention of someone who had decided this mattered before she arrived. Orla came back the following week without needing to explain herself. Her arc was simpler than Bridget's or Joel's. There was no conflict and no near departure, and no crisis, because Orla was 16 and had not yet accumulated the weight of alternative options that makes departure feel possible or necessary. She simply came and came again and learned and became the person on the island who understood things that Hester had not yet explicitly taught anyone. By the 6th week, Orla could read the tide gauge correctly, not from the table but from the instrument itself, and she knew the difference between the 3 main driftwood types they used and what each one contributed to the smoke. She could judge a brine by smell. She was not yet skilled with the racks, which required a physical intuition that came only with repetition, but she was developing it, the way you develop a physical intuition, through the accumulation of small corrections across many attempts. She also documented things. She had a habit of photographing the production process at each stage, first for her geography project and then beyond it, simply because she found the documentation satisfying. She had built a record of the island's production over 4 months that was more systematic than anything Hester had managed, and she had cross-referenced it with Isabel's notebook in ways that had produced 2 observations that Hester had not made herself, and that were useful. Hester knew what this meant. She did not say it aloud. It was the kind of thing that did not need to be said to be understood by either of them. The discovery had happened in the 1st week, before anyone else arrived. Hester had noticed the stone slab in the floor of the curing shed on the 2nd day. Not during the first examination of the space, which had been overwhelmed by the general state of things, but on the 2nd morning when she had been going over the floor systematically, and the slab had presented the same quality of deliberate placement that had become familiar from other scripts that were not Hester's story, but that the world seemed to generate regularly. The flatness of something set rather than settled, the edges a fraction too regular. She had lifted it on the third morning, alone, using the iron bar she had brought with her. The tin box was not deep down. It sat in a dry cavity that had been lined with flat shale fragments to keep the base off the earth, and the tin was sealed with a wax ring around the lid that had done its job across 35 years of nobody opening it. The contents were 2 items. The first was a waterproof notebook, the kind sold in fishing and outdoor shops for use in wet conditions, its cover swollen slightly, but its pages intact, Isabel's name written on the inside cover in her specific hand, and beneath the name, Carrow Isle Production Records, with a date range covering 30 years of work. Every batch, every wood combination, every brine, every note on weather and temperature and outcome and variation, 30 years of sustained attention to what the smoke was doing and what the fish needed and what the island's particular microclimate contributed, written down in the belief that it was worth writing down. Hester sat on the stone floor of the curing shed and read it for 2 hours without moving. The second item was a folded document, a deed of gift, typed on paper that had been treated or was naturally acid-free because it had survived 35 years in a tin box in excellent condition. It transferred the island, described as Carrow Isle, an intertidal island in the coastal jurisdiction of Brackmore Parish, from a name Hester did not recognize, a woman's name, a first name she did not know with an initial for a surname, to Hester Vane, her heirs and assigns. In the margin of the deed, in handwriting, different from the typed text and different from Isabel's, written in ink that had faded to a brown that was still entirely legible, she earned it. Hester read the margin note twice. She did not know who had written it. She did not know who had given the island to Isabel or why or what Isabel had done to earn it. She knew only that someone had watched Isabel do something, over time, and had decided it was sufficient to transfer ownership of a piece of land, and had written 3 words in the margin of the document that explained the whole of it. She set the deed down beside the notebook. She took the tide gauge from her coat pocket and set it on the stone floor beside both of them. She thought, I did not know. She thought, she did not tell me. She thought, there was not time, or I was not listening, or both. Then she thought, but the notebook is here. Everything she knew is here. And I am here. And that is enough to begin with. She put the notebook and the deed back in the tin, and put the tin in the cottage, on the shelf where Isabel's other things had once been, and she went back to work. The smoking began in the 3rd week. Hester had sourced the first fish through the Brackmore harbor network, which Tam had facilitated without being asked to facilitate, simply by mentioning to 2 of the remaining active fishing boats that someone on Carrow Isle was working again. The first boat had brought a box of mackerel and left it at the pier without ceremony. Hester had brined them to Isabel's ratio, as close as she could read it from the notebook, and cold smoked them over a combination of driftwood and the peat she had brought across in a bag at Orla's suggestion. The result was not perfect. It was close, and she knew where it had not been correct, and she adjusted. The second batch was better. The third was what it should be. Bridget had tasted the 3rd batch at the pier on the day of completion. She was not an easy person to impress with food. She had cooked for a fisherman for 40 years, and she ate what the sea produced without sentimentality. She tasted the smoked mackerel with the same directness she brought to everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is not the same as shop-bought." Hester said, "No." Bridget said, "That is something else." She tasted it again. She said, "That is the taste of this place. That specific taste. I have not tasted it since I was a child, and my father brought something from the island. I did not know what it was." She looked at Hester. She said, "It was your mother's." Hester said, "It was, and now it is mine." She set the notebook open on the curing shed table after that, accessible, and each of them in their different ways and at their different times came to read it. Joel with a marine biologist's analytical attention, Orla with the systematic thoroughness she brought to everything she needed to understand, Bridget more slowly, rereading the same entries several times, finding in Isabel's account of the island's waters a description of the place she had fished for 20 years from a perspective she had not previously had access to. The vindication came through the hotel. The Brackmore Arms was a hotel of moderate size and serious food, run by a chef named Patrick Hale, who had been in the kitchen for 15 years and who sourced his fish from industrial suppliers because there had been no local alternative that met his standards. Hester had sent a sample through Tam, who knew Patrick, and Patrick had tasted it and rung the number Tam gave him and placed a first order that was twice what Hester had expected. He came to the island 3 months after the first order, he said, standing in the curing shed and looking at the racks and the equipment. I worked for a restaurant in my 20s that sourced from a woman who worked an island on the north coast. The smoked fish was unlike anything I had tasted before or since. I have been looking for something like it for 15 years, Hester said. Which coast? He named it. It was the right coast, the right era. The timing was correct. Hester looked at him. She said, What was the woman's name? He said he did not know. She had not come to the restaurant. The fish had arrived with the boat, and her name had not come with it. Hester was quiet for a moment. She said, I think it was my mother. He looked at her. She said, Her name was Hester Vane. She worked this island for 30 years. The silence in the curing shed had the quality of something completing. Patrick said, How do you know it was her? Hester took the notebook from the shelf and found the entry for the year and the season and showed it to him. The wood combination, the brine, the note about the weather that week being good for smoke. He read it. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said, She was the best I ever tasted. I have never said that about any food. I have thought it. Hester said, She taught me everything I know. She was already better than she had been in the 3rd week, and she was going to be better still in the months that followed, because Isabel's notebook was 30 years of the knowledge she was carrying, and the knowledge was available to be studied and understood in ways she had not had access to when it was only in her hands and not on the page in front of her. She worked from the notebook and from her hands, and the place where the two converged was where the product was correct. Margot's letter arrived on a Thursday. It was handwritten, which was unusual for Margot, who communicated by text and email with the efficiency of someone who valued speed over tone. The handwriting was careful, which suggested she had thought about what she was writing rather than simply sending it, which was the closest Margot came to vulnerability in written form. The letter said that she had heard the island was operational again, that she was glad things were working out, and that if Hester ever thought about selling, she should know that there were buyers who would pay well for coastal island properties with existing structures. It said nothing about the assisted living complex on the Hill Road. It said nothing about Forsyth or the house or the morning in the hallway or any of the things that had preceded this letter. It treated the present as if it had arrived fully formed, without a past that needed accounting for. Hester read it once. She considered it for a moment, not with anger, which had come and gone months before, but with the specific sadness of recognizing that Margot was not going to be able to say the thing that mattered, and that this letter was the nearest she was going to get. She put it in the tin box beside Isabel's notebook and the deed. She did not reply. The tin box was a good place for things that were significant and unresolved. Alec Drummond had been Hester's neighbor for 20 years in Brackmore, the man in the house directly across the road. a retired librarian who had known Douglas and had been steady and quiet after Douglas died in the way that certain neighbors are, undemanding and present. He had known about the island, as most people in Brackmore knew about it in the vague way that local knowledge holds information without pressing it into use. He had never said anything useful about it when it might have mattered. He appeared at the landward end of the causeway on a Sunday afternoon in October, without explanation. Hester saw him from the island as she was working near the pier, a figure on the shore standing at the causeway entrance, hands in pockets. She raised a hand. He raised one back. She went on working. He stood there. At the end of the day, when she crossed back at the low tide, she came off the causeway, and he was still there, and he fell into step beside her on the harbor road without speaking, and they walked back to the town together, and he had not said anything useful then either, but he had been there. That was, she had come to understand, the way Alec expressed things, in presence rather than in words. She crossed back to the island the next morning, and he was not there, and she did not expect him to be. The evenings were the best part. In the hour before the tide closed the causeway, when the others had gone or were finishing for the day, Hester went to the stone pier and stood at the end of it with the tide gauge held out over the water, reading the level. She did not need to do this. She knew the tides now from 3 months of crossing twice a day, and she had Tam's information and the table she had downloaded to her phone and her own accumulated sense of how the water moved around the island, which was becoming instinct rather than knowledge. But Isabel had done it. She knew this from the notebook, the daily entry that always began with the tide reading, the gauge level noted at this specific hour of the evening, the reading recorded in the same column for 30 years. She had not decided to repeat the gesture. She had found herself doing it one evening in the second week, gauge in hand, standing at the end of the pier, and had understood part-way through that she was doing what Isabel had done at this time of day on this pier, and had continued, because stopping would have felt like a deliberate refusal of something she did not want to refuse. The reading itself was always what the table said it would be. The water was the water. The gauge told her what the tide was doing. She already knew what the tide was doing. That was not the point. Tam saw her from the water one evening in November. He was motoring past the south side of the island in his boat at the end of a day on the water, and he saw her at the end of the pier with the gauge out over the water, the same position, the same gesture, the same hour of the evening that Isabel had stood there for 30 years. He cut the engine. The boat moved in the sudden quiet, settling on its own wake, and he watched. He had been 14 the first time he had seen Isabel do this, and he had asked his father what the woman on the island was doing with the small brass thing in her hand, and his father had said she was reading the tide, and he had said, "But she must know the tide already," and his father had said, "Yes, she does," and had not explained further. Tam had come to understand what his father had not explained across the years of watching Isabel work, which was that knowing the tide was not the same as the act of reading it each evening, and that the act was something between a measurement and a habit and a form of attention that the island and its waters required of the person living on them. A way of staying connected to the specific fact of where you were. He said nothing. He restarted the engine. He went on. He said nothing to Hester about it the following morning at the harbor. She did not know he had seen it. It was between Tam and the water and the memory of Isabel, which was where it belonged. The curing shed in November smelled exactly as it had smelled when Hester was 9 years old, standing at Isabel's side watching the smoke move through the rack and wondering how her mother knew what she knew, and whether she herself would ever know it. She knew it now. Not all of it. She was not Isabel, and she was not going to pretend that 35 years of absence and reduced practice had left her knowledge intact. But she had the notebook, and she had her hands, and she had the island, and she had time, and she had 3 people who came across the causeway at low tide, and were building their own knowledge alongside hers, which was not what Isabel had had, but was perhaps better, because knowledge that lives in more than one set of hands is harder to lose. Isabel had worked alone for 30 years. Hester did not intend to. The island was large enough for more than one person's knowledge, and what she was building here was going to outlast her, which was the point, and had always been the point, even when she had not known it yet. Hester worked the last hour of the day in the curing shed, the rack loaded, the smoke moving through the chamber. The way it moved on the days she had the combination correct, which she was getting right more often than not now, which was not the same as always, but was enough to work from, and considerably more than she had been able to do in a kitchen in Brackmore with the wrong wood and 2 little fish, and no island air. She put the tide gauge on the hook by the curing shed door, where it had lived since the 2nd week, the same hook Isabel had put it on in the cottage for 30 years. She turned off the daylight lamp. She stood in the dark curing shed with the smell of the smoke and the sound of the water and the island around her, entirely itself, indifferent and exactly right. She thought, here then, still here, she thought, still her island, still her work, still the tide gauge on the hook and the smoke in the stone and the notebook on the shelf. She opened the door and went out to the pier. The tide was coming in. The causeway was already covered at the deep center. An hour, and she would be staying on the island tonight, which she had done twice before and which she did not mind, the sleeping in the cottage and the sound of the water being a different quality of sleep from anything she had known for 35 years. She stood at the end of the pier and held the tide gauge out over the water. The reading was what she expected. She stayed there until the last light was gone. All she had come here with was a coat and 2 bags and 200 pounds and 35 years of avoiding something that turned out to be the thing she was for. All she needed was what was already here, and what was here was hers. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, tell us in the comments what you think Isabel did to earn the island, and whether you think Hester will ever find out the full story of who gave it to her. And if you know someone who has been told at 74 that there is nothing left for them to build, send them this today, because Hester Vane has something to say to that. We are grateful for every one of you who reaches the end. We will see you in the next one.